My name is Garrett, and it is my pleasure to be with you to bring a word to the church in Tennessee this weekend. I've been asked to come and talk with you about what it means to love and serve in America at this moment. And it is a great pleasure for me to be able to do that with you. I am a professor at Baylor University, the theologian in residence at the American Cathedral in Paris, and a lay preacher in the Episcopal Church. And it is a joy for me to talk with you about how our baptismal covenant calls us into relationship with the world as it is in this moment in 2020. My great hope had been to be with you on the mountain, to be with you and to share relationship with you, and honestly to eat some barbecue with you on this weekend. I am coming to you from Austin, Texas today, which, as you may or may not know, thinks of itself as the headquarters of barbecue for the world. But one of the tasks that I had been given as a speaker for this weekend with you was to be a judge for the barbecue contest. And I cannot tell you how much my heart hurts not to be able to do that. So my hope is that this word that I bring to you this weekend, this conversation that we begin, will be the beginning of a conversation that extends into the church in Tennessee and also extends into an invitation to me to come and have some barbecue with you as the world moves into some kind of normality. I want to talk with you today about the baptismal covenant in our Book of Common Prayer and what it calls us to in 2020. And it is my hope that our conversation this weekend will lead into further conversations. And so I want to move into my prepared remarks right now. Last February at Trinity Wall Street in Lower Manhattan, and the week before that in the nave of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., I sat with an audience and watched Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, 31 years old now. If you have ever seen the film, you may remember that one of its most distinctive and enduring insights is how we don't listen to each other. We talk over each other or past each other. We scream at each other. We play our music not to enjoy but to deafen each other. The characters in Spike Lee's film seem to be speaking so loudly so that they don't have to listen. And the few moments of actual conversation feel blessed as a result. At the end of the movie, when Spike Lee and Danny Aiello confront each other in the wreckage of their neighborhood and try to talk to each other as two different but definitely human beings, it feels like grace because it is so rare. This movie, screaming, division, violence, and those attempts to find some common ground, remains so powerful because we see ourselves on that screen. After those screenings, I sat on stage and laughed off stage with my friend, the very Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, the fierce, smart, feminist African-American theologian who is dean of our Episcopal Divinity School at Union Seminary. Kelly and I helped to put together these programs on racism, film, and reconciliation for Washington National Cathedral and for Trinity Wall Street. And we have been working together on these projects for years now. But our story of continued conversations still strikes both of us as noteworthy, partly because, as she likes to tell people when she wants to poke at me, why on earth would a white boy from the South want to talk about racism with me? I will tell you, when we first started talking about the idea of doing an annual film festival at the National Cathedral about race, she thought I was crazy. But he kept showing up, she said in a video we shot together for Trinity Wall Street. And he kept wanting to talk, and finally I decided, maybe he's not crazy. Maybe he's different. The idea that we might want to talk to someone radically different from ourselves does strike some people as crazy. We live in a society that has divided itself into gated communities. This nation feels more divided than at any time in my memory, racially, politically, culturally, religiously, socially, in just about every way there is. Newt Gingrich wrote an article for Fox News a while back on a study he'd been involved in. And that study concluded that overwhelmingly Americans are concerned about the stark divisions between us and the tone we take when we talk to each other. We seem to be stuck. How can we be in dialogue? And more importantly, doing the work to which we are called by the church, when we can't seem to even see each other, hear each other, acknowledge any error, or even acknowledge the possibility that those who differ from us have come to their positions through their own reflection, experience, and even prayer? For those of us in positions of relative privilege and power, why should we reach out to those who need help or understanding, or for those whose experience needs to be seen and acknowledged? This is why I wanted to bring this piece of conversation to you, because I think the task of reconciliation is an essential part of what it means to live together in our faith communities. How can we, as Episcopal members of the Jesus movement, work to bridge the gaps in our culture? Well, first, I think it means by deciding that we must. I've had the great privilege in the last few years to get to know Dr. Catherine Meeks, Executive Director of the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta. Last year in New York at Trinity Wall Street, she sat in front of us, and echoing Jesus' question at the Pool of Siloam, she asked us simply this: do you want to be healed? Do you want to be healed? Do you want to push back against the hate and misunderstanding that fills the world, against the systematic evils in this nation, against the belittling of some of God's precious children? Is being healed, she asked us, more important than being black or being white? If we can't, in our heart of hearts, answer that question yes, then, she said, nothing I say from this point on will be convincing to you. But if you are still considering, let's move forward. I have spent the last 4 years convening conversations like those in Washington and New York, using film as a way of breaking into discussions on racism and prejudice. As a Christian and as a child of the South, I know that race is perhaps the central divide in our American life. And that has been where my focus has been of late. But some of the things I've learned about racism, justice, reconciliation, and healing with Kelly Brown Douglas and with other people have allowed me to understand the staggering divisions between us. And so right now I'd like to talk to you about next steps, the why and how, connected to the stranger, the alien, and to anyone we perceive as on the opposite side of the divide from us. Even if those people from whom you're separated turn out to be your mom, your kids, your next door neighbor. In 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul proclaims that Jesus has given to us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, as followers of Jesus, we are tasked with bringing people back into harmony, back into conversation, and back into communion. I regard this as a primary task of the church, if not the primary task. One of the mottos For the conversations I've been convening on race and prejudice grows out of a remark that the very Reverend Douglas made a year or so ago, that these conscious efforts toward reconciliation are not optional, that they are, in fact, the very gospel. I believe her. So in this moment, I want to talk to you and then encourage you to talk to each other in Tennessee about how these gospel imperatives and our baptismal covenant call us to engage the world, bind its wounds, and offer an alternative to estrangement and distrust. And I want to be clear, I am speaking out of my position as a white, middle-class Episcopalian. For as Kelly Brown Douglas and Dr. Meeks would tell you, while all of us are called to love and all of us are called to this ministry of reconciliation, white Episcopalians have a responsibility to take an active role in this process because of the relative privilege we've been given. Now, some of you, I know, I understand this perfectly, may not feel privileged at the end of the month when we're wondering how our money will hold out. But I wanted to tell you about a conversation that I had on stage at the National Conversation last year, which echoed one of the life-changing talks that I've had with Kelly Brown Douglas. After we had screened Do the Right Thing, a panel of writers and theologians was talking, and NPR's Corva Coleman invited each of us to reflect on how we had encountered the police in our communities. My friend Van Newkirk, who writes on race, politics, and culture for The Atlantic, put his hands out in the air in front of him, holding an imaginary steering wheel at 10 and 2. This man, this brilliant man whose mind should be declared a national treasure, was demonstrating for our audience how, as a black man, even a brilliant black man, his first concern was to keep his hands in plain view so he would not get shot during a routine traffic stop. Some years ago, Kelly Brown Douglas and I talked about the talk. And it was one of the most important moments of understanding in my life. In white households, the talk is about the birds and the bees. And while the consequences discussed are serious, they are rarely life-threatening. But in black households, the talk is about briefing your kids, especially young black men, about how to respond when they encounter law enforcement so that they have the best chance of surviving that encounter. I have 2 sons, both grown now, and you can be assured that I never had or felt I needed to have that talk with them. And thinking back to admittedly my checkered adolescence, I was pulled over in my small town in Oklahoma with some regularity by the police, and never did I feel more than annoyance. I never worried that I might get shot. It never even occurred to me. So in this and in lots of other ways, if we pay attention, even though I may feel like I've worked hard for everything I've achieved, even though I may not feel particularly privileged, I have learned that I most certainly have been. And as we will learn, the honesty and bravery to acknowledge this are important steps in authentic racial reconciliation. At the heart of our conversation today is our baptismal covenant. Evan Daniel wrote in 1892 that the Book of Common Prayer was more than just a liturgical manual. It was, he said, the fullest statement of the teaching of the Church. Even if these particular words entered the prayer book in this fashion in 1979, this contractual covenant, renewed every time we welcome another member into the body of Christ, is at the heart of our Episcopal faith. Will we, as Augustine of Hippo suggests, seek and serve Christ by loving our neighbors? Augustine argued, by the way, that everyone, everywhere, is our neighbor. Not just the people in our silo or the next silo over. Will we be agents of justice and peace who respect every human being's dignity? The ones we resemble and the ones we don't. Brothers, this is the task we have promised to take on. And the baptismal covenant suggests that if we want to be healed, this is how it's going to happen. Augustine described the core of the Christian life to be what he called the twofold commandment of love. Love God, love your neighbor. Many Christians make a good effort at the first. Doing the second can often be harder. And yet, Augustine tells us this is the greater call. If we cannot love our neighbor who we can see, how do we love God who we cannot see? It is the quality that defines us. They will know we are Christians by our love. Because the forces of this world are hate, evil, darkness, and injustice, and only love can conquer them. Because in every great story, whether the story of Jesus or of the Blessed Virgin Mary or of Martin Luther King, the willingness to love sacrificially and counterintuitively, to, as Dr. King said, develop a dangerous unselfishness, is the only way that the world moves forward. Love makes us just. Love makes us want to correct those things that are not love. Love transforms us. Love leads us to reconciliation and in the direction of healing. In her work on racial healing for the Episcopal Church, Catherine Meeks has outlined a process. And some of these steps might apply to other kinds of healing as well. There are steps that ask us to renounce some of our cultural teachings on being right and ignoring contradictions. They ask us to be brave enough to be vulnerable. But I believe they also offer us hope. First, Dr. Meeks says, we need to look at our past actions, at our history, and to find those moments where what we have done stands in opposition to Christ's love and compassion. Those moments might be institutional, they might be personal, but wherever we find that we have acted wrongly, or that we have acted without all the information we needed, we need to name those actions, claim them as our own, renounce them, and ask forgiveness for them. We do corporate confession every Sunday, but we confess to be reconciled with God and with our neighbor. And sometimes our neighbor may need to hear us taking responsibility, which is something that happens rarely and badly in our culture. It seems like something we do not generally do very well. Confess and take responsibility for our actions. But there is so much power in the simple acknowledgement. And while we risk rejection, we also have the possibility of beginning to build a bridge. When Kelly Brown Douglas and I talked about the talk almost 4 years ago, it was the first serious personal conversation we had ever had. Although I grew up in Atlanta and Charlotte, although I am a good white liberal Christian, I was stunned by my lack of understanding of the Black experience. And I told her so. More importantly, I told her how sorry I was that she had to fear for her son every time he walks out the door. Now, Kelly could have cut me down. She could have turned away, but instead she inclined her head once, gravely, looked me in the eye, and said, "Thank you, my brother." And in that moment, something that seemed impossible was born. Now you'll notice that naming, claiming, contrition, and conversation are all steps in this process. Kelly Brown Douglas and I did not proclaim to the world that day, racial healing has been achieved. In fact, Catherine Meeks told me that she no longer uses the word reconciliation when she talks about racism, because people, especially I would guess people who look like me, are so anxious to jump to the end of the process and to proclaim that we are done. No, she says. Reconciliation is a process, a marathon, not a sprint. And healing happens along the way, not at some finish line. Our salvation is with each other, St. Anthony proclaimed. So did James Baldwin and Dr. King. Until all of us are free, none of us are free. It is a constant struggle because as human beings, we are all angry at or afraid of somebody, some group, some individuals. In Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee suggests that every human being wrestles with racism and prejudice. And even if we manage to do okay with race, there is probably something else. My continuing prejudice against the conservative Christians who formed me is just as egregious an offense in the eyes of God as neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville. For my own spiritual and emotional good, I need to confess and to repent. And I do so again now. I'm still struggling to forgive. I was blessed by Kelly Brown Douglas when we began this long journey together, and I am blessed by her along the way, but the contrition or forgiveness of others isn't up to us. My own call to love and to forgive, to build bridges instead of walls, isn't dependent on what others are willing to do. No matter what political party you support, what color your skin is, where you live, how much you own, your opinion on whose James Bond was the best, I am called to love you and to see your full and beautiful humanity. Contrition does not change the other party, but it does change us. And it puts us in a sacred space where some miracle might happen. The British novelist Graham Greene says in several of his novels that we cannot know the depth and power of God's grace. And that is a beautiful thing, lovely words on the page, but is such a miracle of grace possible in a world full of divisions? Well, my mother was raised in a small town in Oklahoma. And African Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic people were definitely the kinds of people whom my family was suspicious of. One of my favorite stories is about how my mom came to St. James Episcopal Church in Austin, that multicultural church that rescued me and patched me up and sent me back out into the world. I put off taking her for the longest time, not just because St. James is multiracial, but also because St. James was full of multicultural relationships and full of LGBTQ people. And I honestly thought my mom's head might explode. I loved these people so much, and if my mom didn't love them too, it was going to break my heart. So on this Sunday morning, we sat in the church, and my mom was holding it together until it came time for the Eucharist. And the people of St. James started filing past us on their way to God's table. People of every color and hue, people who loved in lots of different ways. an interracial lesbian couple with their adopted baby girl. When she saw them, my mom started sniffling next to me in the pew. All right, I said to myself, here we go. I knew it was coming. Maybe she could just limit it to sobbing, but she couldn't. It was full-on weeping, a multi-Kleenex cry, and I turned to her ready to hear whatever judgment she was going to have to offer because of where she'd come from and who had raised her. I turned to her, and she turned to me. And tears running down her cheeks, my mother said, "It's so beautiful. This must be what heaven looks like." Don't imagine that you or I understand a thing about God's marvelous grace. I can do nothing on my own, St. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 12:9. But God's grace is sufficient. It's not our job to heal, only God can do that. But we can push back against the hate and injustice, against the divisions we ourselves have helped to create. We can put ourselves and others in a place where they can begin to see what the beloved community might look like. We can be honest, ask for forgiveness, reach out, say, we want to do better. This conversation we're beginning right now could lead to conversation in our homes and churches and coffee shops, to sermons and teaching on bridging the divides between us, to small groups and reading groups and film festivals exploring reconciliation. And most importantly, it can lead us to our renewed commitment to be Christ's agent of reconciliation in this world, to love and serve Him faithfully, to live up to our most sacred vows. It is hard work. Don't I know it? But there may be no more important work for us as followers of Jesus. I am so grateful for the opportunity to bring you this word. Please know that you are in my prayers, and in my prayers is my hope that we will meet each other face to face. And when we meet face to face, there will be barbecue. May God be with us. Amen.